Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. On behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, Georgia State University, Perimeter College, and the Georgia Humanities Council, welcome to the Revival Lost Southern Voices Festival. A few notes before we begin our session this afternoon. If you would like to look at the program for today's session, plus the entire program for the festival, you'll find the link over in the chat section. Also, we have enabled the closed caption feature on Zoom, so you can find the CC button at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your device. If you click on it, then you can resize the font to make it more readable for you at home. We'd also like to remind you that if you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question after the formal presentation, to use the Q&A feature. You'll find the Q&A button at the top and bottom of your screen, and that way we can better keep track of the questions that you all ask during the session. You can also look for the recordings of this festival after the festival on our YouTube channel. Right now, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce the moderator for today's session, Monica Lee Weatherly. She is a poet, writer, and professor of English at Georgia State University, Perimeter College. She is the 2021 winner of the Willie Morris Prize for Southern Poetry, a 2023 Key West Literary Seminar Workshop Fellowship recipient, and the author of the chapbook of poetry, It Felt Like Mississippi. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in numerous literary journals, including Tulane Review, Plain Songs Magazine, Missouri Journal, Merge Literary Magazine, Obsidian, South Florida Poetry Journal, and Auburn Avenue. She is a member of the Georgia Writers Association and is listed in the Georgia Writers Registry. Her writing often focuses on the culture and experiences of women of color in the American South. Once again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the second session of the Georgia Poet Laureates Through the Years at the Revival Lost Southern Voices Festival. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Monica to begin today's presentation. Monica?
Thank you so much, Joe. It is a pleasure to introduce our panelists, Jim Clark and Bill Walsh, presenting Georgia Poets Laureate Through the Years. Jim Clark was born in Byrdstown, Tennessee. He holds a BA from Vanderbilt University, the MFA from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and a PhD from the University of Denver. He has taught at Auburn University and the University of Georgia, where he directed the creative writing program. He is professor emeritus at Barton College in Wilson, North Carolina, where he was dean of the School of Humanities and the Elizabeth H. Jordan Chair of Southern Literature. His books, Notions, a Jim Clark miscellany, two collections of poetry, Dancing on Canaan's Ruins and Handiwork, and he edited Fable in the Blood, the selected poems of Byron Herbert Reese. His work has appeared in the Georgia Review, Prairie Schooner, Southern Poetry Review, Denver Quarterly, Greensboro Review, and Asheville Poetry Review. He has released 2 solo CDs, Buried Land and The Service of Song, and 3 CDs with his band, The Never Myths. Bill Walsh is the director of the Etowah Valley MFA program at Reinhardt University. In 2022, his debut novel, Lakewood, was published by Touchpoint Press. The poetry anthology, Why I Wrote This Poem, was published by McFarlane and Company in 2023. His most recent collection of poems, Fly Fishing in Times Square, was published by Cervena Brava Press in Boston after winning the 2019 Editor's Prize. His novels, The Boomerang Mattress and Haircuts for the Dead, have been finalists and semifinalists in the William Faulkner Pirate Alley Prize. His novel, The Pig Rider, was a finalist in 2015, and his other books include Speak, So I Shall Know Thee, Interviews with Southern Writers, The Ordinary Life of a Sculptor, The Conscious of My Other Being, Under the Rock Umbrella, Contemporary American Poets from 1951 to 1977, David Bottom's Critical Essays and Interviews, and Lost in the White Ruins. His work has appeared in AWP Chronicles, Cimarron Review, 5 Points, Flannery O'Connor Review, the Georgia Review, the Kenyon Review, Literary Matters, Michigan Quarterly, North American Review, Poetry Daily, and Poets and Writers. His literary interviews have been published in over 50 journals and include, among others, interviews with Joseph Brodsky, A.R. Ammons, Doris Betts, Richard Blanco, Evan Boland, Pat Conroy, David Bottoms, Harry Crews, James Dickey, Ariel Dorfman, Mark Dottie, Rita Dove, and Stephen Dunn, and also Mary Hood. And the list continues. He is also the editor of the James Dickey Review. It is such a pleasure to introduce these two panelists. Jim, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Monica. It's a pleasure to be here to talk a little bit about Bettie Sellers. Born in Young Harris, Georgia in 1926, Bettie Sellers was reared in Middle Georgia near Griffin. She received her BA degree from LaGrange College in 1958 and her MA from the University of Georgia in 1966, after which she began teaching at Young Harris College. She retired as the Gouldsby Professor of English and Chair of the English Department after 32 years. She was named Author of the Year by the Dixie Council of Authors and Journalists in 1979 and 1982. She received the Governor's Award in the Humanities in 1987, and in 1992 was named Poet of the Year by the National League of American Pen Women. In 1997, she was appointed State Poet Laureate by Governor Zell Miller and served in that capacity for 3 years. She received the Stanley W. Lindbergh Award in 2003 and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Georgia Writers Association in 2004. However, over the past couple of decades, we have heard less and less about Bettie Sellers. Perhaps it's time for a reconsideration. Sellers published 4 volumes of poetry, including Spring Onions and Cornbread, 1978, Morning of the Red-tailed Hawk, 1981, Liza's Monday and Other Poems, 1986, and Wild Ginger, 1989. She also published 3 chapbooks and The Bitter Berry, The Life of Byron Herbert Reese in 1992. Spring Onions and Cornbread features poems that are simple but vivid snapshots of the rural people and places of North Georgia. The speaker is often a precocious young girl who is curious about the lives of her neighbors and extended family, but also about the wide world that lies outside of her tiny community, which she knows by glimpses of famous paintings decorating the walls of her house, Shakespeare, whom she encounters in school courtesy of a traveling troupe of actors, and classical music on her family's Victrola. And I'll share with you 3 poems from Spring Onions and Cornbread. The first one is called The Day Dick and Jane Bit the Dust, which is a nice introduction to the wry humor that Bettie's poems often possess. The Day Dick and Jane Bit the Dust. I must have been 10 the spring a traveling troupe came to tread the creaking boards at Orr's Elementary. The Merchant of Venice it was, and the country girl soared off, brief in hand, into a grease paint world. No more a cowboy aiming stick rifles at the wily Sioux in the plum thicket behind the school. I glided down dirt paths to Belmont and beyond, pleading my case with maidenly conviction, or walking as became a queen on the arm of my Lord Bassanio. It dropped again, that gentle rain, when my cousin, grown up with his newest hobby, covered the complete plays in white leather for my birthday. Portia had come to our house to stay, daily expounding the quality of mercy to Bess and Lou in the pasture, or the crawfish stirring up the mud in the bottom of Shoal Creek. This one is called Camp Meeting. There's power in the blood, and August floored with sawdust, slab-sided shingled tents, and second-best dishes brought in cardboard boxes sweet with pound cakes and boiled custard. The tinny piano, hoarse from a year's disuse, leads the choir, fervent in print dresses, cooled with Pittman's funeral home fans, the old talk, old times, how Grandpa prayed all night over the town drunkard and converted him to Sam Jones, a mighty preacher. The young run fast games of tag, hurrying up the years until they're old enough to meet in shy pairs and hold hands on the last bench. Across the dirt road, the family graves lie blanketed brown with last year's pine needles, where early spring will push up green with daffodils. And this one, appreciation of the arts. We had The Man with the Hoe, black and white on the third grade wall, and The Blue Boy, bright on the cover of a calendar that came with 2 boxes of cloverine salve. When I was 8, I memorized Joaquin Miller's Columbus and went around for months reciting sail on and on, until practically everybody in the neighborhood and Orr's Elementary wished that America had never been found. But best of all was the old Edison in the front hall. We fought for the privilege of cranking up its wheezy insides and choosing a thick black disc of Madame Schumann-Hank warbling away in German, Caruso's faraway voice in the Pagliacci, and 2 whole records, front and back, of how somebody seduced somebody else in Cavaliera Rusticana. We hadn't the foggiest notion what it all meant, but it did liven up a rainy afternoon when thunder had drowned out the chorus of tree toads rehearsing in the alder bushes down behind the barn. And that was Spring Onions and Cornbread, her first full volume of poems. Morning of the Red-Tailed Hawk is much broader in scope, with poems set in coastal Georgia and England and Europe, as well as North Georgia. The subject matter is more sophisticated, ranging from civil rights and LGBTQ issues to modern warfare, ecology, and technology. Formally, the poems are more sophisticated too, bearing the stamp of Sellers' mentor, Byron Herbert Reese. And this is that book, The Morning of the Red-Tailed Hawk. And I'll share a few poems from it. This one called Revelation. One fine day I was grown up, could read the piece of paper framed over the Browns' dining table, unfamiliar words to spell out while Susie finished dawdling over her lunch so we could get back to the dam we were building in the creek. I figured the curly black letters, Ku Klux Klan, must be like the farmers group my dad went to and came back telling Mama what Mr. Roosevelt was going to do about the price of cotton. Another fine Saturday, I read the scroll again over fried pork chops and turnip greens, choked to realize that this was the group of men that talked about in Dad's store, the one they said wore white hoods, burned crosses in the night. Susie and I built other dams in Shoal Creek, but when they asked me to stay to lunch, I told a lie, said I had to get home. Too uneasy to sit down that close to Mr. Brown's horns, the forked tail twitching inside his overalls. This one, Complaint to Beetlejuice. I used to know that stars were stars and stayed wherever in that distant space their ordered orbit was. The sky was snug with Cassiopeia's chair, and night had big and little bears to hunt. Then winking, moving lights began to stitch an arch from Sunset Ridge to Raven Cliffs, plains to Birmingham and points beyond, with travelers drowsing past sleeping hills folded like dark velvet with ribbons wound for lake and stream, silver and reflected light. Now satellites invade the ridge. The star I thought was Venus rising keeps on rising out of sight to bring the morning's news, and wars are instantaneously played on beams that tear Orion's belt, divide Andromeda. This one called In the Counselor's Waiting Room. The terracotta girl with big flat farm feet traces furrows in the rug with her toes, reads an existentialist paperback from psychology class, finds no ease there from guilt of loving the quiet girl down the hall. Their home soil has seen to this visit, their Baptist mothers who weep for the waste of sturdy hips, ripe for grandchildren. A couple of poems about music. This one is called Bluegrass Interval. Because I got away from you, sat the afternoon by Notley River, chilling my toes with three small boys, slim as minnows in brown water, feasted on bluegrass sounds, a dulcimer and two guitars keening in the breeze of an oak, tasted the bitterness of walnuts in homemade brownies sold at a booth with coffee sweet in a plastic cup. Punish me. I could have stayed at home and listened to your breath rasping in the shuttered room like a warped guitar. And this little poem in three parts. Three songs heard at brass band. Number one, The Old Man. Fingers like new dug sweet potato roots, knobs swollen at the joints. How can they coax such music from the cherry wood dulcimer in his lap? Amazing grace, that's what it is. And oh, how sweet the sound. Number two, The Void. Eyes shuttered behind glass, the backside of one hand trusting his companion's arm, winding around roots and mud puddles toward Phil's pottery booth. Long sounds like pine needles on pine needles falling on clay and glaze, smooth to the touch. Kneeling, his long fingers gentle trace the curve and lip on wheel-thrown shapes. Three, The Swallowtail. Cross-legged, his back against an oak, Phil fans his fingers on the strings, fluttering for me the song a swallowtail evoked, a black and yellow butterfly that came to perch, light as a leaf on the guitar's bridge, one day when he was playing down by Little Falls. So might David have laid his hands upon an ancient lyre, shaping notes to fly across the Palestinian sky, like swallows darting just at dusk above his quietly grazing flocks. And since that poem mentioned a dulcimer, I thought I might give you just a taste of the sound of the dulcimer to go along with those two poems about music. This is my dulcimer. It was made by Mr. John Maxwell in my hometown of Cookeville, Tennessee, many years ago. And I believe it is a cherry wood dulcimer, so that fits with the poem too. So if you'll bear with me for just a second, I will try to arrange my computer. Okay, that'll do it. This will be very brief, but a little bit of Amazing Grace, since that's what that poem mentioned. All right, here we go. One more poem from Morning of the Red-tailed Hawk. Not anything more fair. I stood where he had stood, heard snatches of the same old song flowing in the current of the brown river. I held my breath and felt the cadence of Big Ben's round mark the hour of my coming. The sun darted up through scudding clouds, brushed the houses of Parliament, bright with streaks of golden fire, and made their towers lean into the wind as though in benediction. London was still asleep, so I spoke his words aloud for no one to hear, only a seagull dipping in the wake of a barge below Westminster Bridge. So you can see how these poems do evince a wider knowledge of the world, and travel, and so forth. Liza's Monday and other poems harks back chronologically to the 19th century. One is tempted to call their genre historical poetry, just as some modern writers write historical fiction. The poems are mostly vivid character sketches, with some grouped together in numbered, intertwining narratives telling the story of a family or a community. And this is that book, Liza's Monday and Other Poems. And I'll read just a couple of poems from it. First one is called Pink. Her mama called her Pink when she was born, to match a tiny flower pressed in Exodus from Charleston Gardens. It's like not found among the blossoms wild in Brasstown soil. She called the two boys Flotsam and Jetsam, having heard such words ring somewhere with all the strength of heroes, Samson, Saul, though never could she find them in the book, no matter if she searched to Revelation's end. The last child Mama named Rebecca, to be sure, making up for giving wrong names to the boys, and those now stuck too tight to bud. Then Mama died, not knowing just how right she had called her boys, hell-bent to leave the plow and hoe for parts out west where gold grew common as the stones they cursed in winding valley roads. In time, their faces faded as Pink brushed Rebecca's long hair, the color of her own. She washed and cooked up on a wooden stool that Papa made so she could reach the tubs and stove. She stitched the gown for Rebecca's wedding day, embroidered it with pinks and ragged robins round the neck and sleeves. In other springs, she knitted caps for babies never hers. She did for Papa till his days were through, and kept the cabin neat as Mama ever could. Alone she withered slowly, frail and dry as petals caught and pressed by Exodus. This one is called Mornings Sheba Combs Her Hair. She watches from the open door, the man, long-legged, tall and straight, his hair aflame like foxes make as they run through the broom sedge patch behind her house. This neighbor passes by each day to climb the slope of Cedar Ridge, cut logs to build a barn near where the trail that crosses Unicoi turns west through Brasstown Gap. She watches, thinking how her own man, gone these 3 years, never had that loose-limbed stride, that fire atop his head. Older than she, he never made her heart run wild and fly across the valley, free as red-tailed hawks rise high on currents of morning air. She watches, planning how one day she'll walk out, ask him how his wife does, how his son. She'll wait beside the big oak, ask him in to warm his hands before her hearth, to notice how her dark hair falls as smooth as water in Corn Creek caresses stones, how she will warm cold fingers in his hair and face eternal burning if she must. And this last one is the title poem, Lies of Monday. She has left her tubs and boiling sheets, fled north across the woodlot, heard no grumble from the pigs as she passed, the chicken shed where eggs wait to be gathered, felt no pain as December's harsh wind dried lye soap on her arms, reddened hands held stiff by her sides, palms forward as to catch the gusts that sweep the slopes of Double Knob. Inside the cabin, Ethan's shirt to patch, the fire to mend, small Isaac sleeping in his crib, soon to wake for nursing. These and other chores are in her keeping, but she hurries up the mountainside as on an April day to search for mint and cress, to find first violets that hide in white and purple patches by Corn Creek. The ridge is steep and rocky, sharp with briars, raked inside by gales howling bleak as northern winds around the cabin whine, but she does not feel the laurel tug her dress, the briars pricking dark red beads that shine on bare arms. All winter afternoon she climbs until she gains the highest rocks, the knobs where one can look out, trace the spines of distant mountains, scan the valley floor. Black dots for shed and cabin, smoke only wisps blown by the wind. Liza sees no more, not broken stones underfoot, not heavy sky holding snow. She sits on Double Knob, back against the ledge, and watches night come by to close the valley, wipe her clearing out as though it had never been. Snow clouds roil around Liza's head, wrap cold arms around bent shoulders, fill her aproned lap, open hands. Below, the wash fire has burned down to embers. Ethan long begun the search across his lands. And I've been unable to locate a copy of Betty's final book of poems, Wild Ginger, which was published in 1989. So we'll have to stop with Liza's Monday. Bettie Sellers elevated the status of the Georgia Poet Laureate, was an important figure in Appalachian literature, and contributed significantly to the literary reputation of young Harris College. She did much to popularize the neglected North Georgia poet and writer Byron Herbert Reese, and was an active member of the Byron Herbert Reese Society. It's been a pleasure to revisit and recommend her thoughtful, finely crafted poems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for reviving the work of former Georgia Poet Laureate Bettie Sellers. It was a pleasure hearing your presentation. Up next, William Walsh.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a PowerPoint here and I'm going to share it. Oops, let me make sure I get everything working here. So can y'all hear me? It's kind of odd. I can't really tell if you can hear me. So if I get a clue on that. But anyways, I was very fortunate to meet David Bottoms when I was in my very early 20s. I think I was 22. And I'd been writing poetry and I didn't know what I was doing, but I heard that there was this poet at Georgia State. And I went to him and took his classes, and it was the thing that changed my life. So one of the things David always wanted us to do in his class, and something he instructed us towards, was finding the truth. What is the truth in a poem? And he used to call it the DHM, the deep hidden meaning. And always we were getting towards, or we needed to get towards, the deep hidden meaning. What were we really trying to get at with the poem and the situation? And it always needed to have a greater meaning. So, whoops, there we go. So I love this quote by David. We all want to break out our orbits, or we all want to break our orbits, float like a satellite gone wild in space, run the risk of disintegration. We all want to take our lives in our own hands and hurl them out among the stars. So sitting in David's class, it was always a situation where he would bring into class what he was reading and what he found profound to him, and he brought it to us to see those things. And so one week it might be something from a Russian novel. The next week it might be a poem from Robert Penn Warren. But he always wanted us to expand our reading and our ideas. So here are some of David's books. North of Damascus, north of a U-Haul, in a U-Haul north of Damascus. This was his second book. And then Armored Hearts, We Almost Disappear. And then his last book, until just this recent one, was Otherworld, Underworld, and Prayer Porch. And then here we have his first book, Shooting Rats at the Bibb County Dump. And he won the Walt Whitman Award for this one, which was chosen by Robert Penn Warren. And in 2004, one of my favorite books of his was Waltzing Through the End Time. It was a different direction for David, the longer narrative, and sort of like Charles Wright. And then most recently, this was just published this last year or so after David died, A Scrap in the Blessings Jar. And it has about a dozen new poems and then selected poems by Ernest Suarez. But what's interesting is I went back and looked. David published in Poetry Magazine 58 times, which is just remarkable. So this is the book I wrote on David. Actually, I was the editor. I have a piece in it, but I asked a lot of scholars and other writers to write critical essays and some interviews with David, and I compiled them back in 2011. So this photograph right here, this is how I remember David when I was young. This is what he looked like early on. He had his beard, really dark, and always, in a t-shirt, liked to play the guitar. And then this is David later on in his life. Um, so just two aspects. All right, so here's the deal. Some of the stuff David always talked about was getting to the truth of your poetry. So there's a philosopher named Tim Rainer, and he says the idea of poetic truth sounds oxymoronic to our modern ears. When we think of truth today, we think it's, either implicitly or explicitly about demonstrable truth, truth that is verifiable. Did this really happen? People are always asking this question. Well, is that a true story? And one of the things we discussed in David's class, which was for me one of the most important aspects of writing poetry, is how do you take something that actually happened and change it to make it more truthful? And this is what we were sort of striving through. What is the deep hidden meaning within your poem or the poem that you're trying to write? And there was always something that we could get at. David didn't want us to write nice little scenes that were well written and kind of interesting. There had to be something deeper than just a scene. It had to have a truth to it. So we almost always want to know, did this really happen? But I've come to realize, and this I'll show you in an example of one of David's poems, but it happened in many of them. And then, of course, other poems by other poets, is that you can assume that most of the time the poet embellished the truth in order to get to the deeper truth, the metaphoric truth. What does this mean? All right. So the problem with assuming that modern scientific truth, which is demonstrable, is the only form of truth, is that it leads us to overlook other forms of truth, even while we make use of them. In fact, this is something that David would talk about, these ideas of how do you create truth or a greater truth from the truth that you have. And it's not easy, but this was one of the things we worked towards. So, such is the case with poetic truth. This is the form of truth that dates back to ancient times. It was challenged by Socrates and defeated by the intellectual culture that grew up in Socrates' wake. And I'll show you here. So this is one of David's, I'd say one of his top 5 most recognizable poems, called My Father's Desk. And it's about David going to school and sitting down in the 2nd or 3rd grade in the same desk that his father had sat in many years prior. And his father had carved the name in, or his name, into the desk. So when he sat there, it already had his name carved into it. So years later, he goes back and breaks into the school to steal the desk. So I asked him about that. I said, did you really steal the desk? Did you break into the school? And he never really had answered the question before, but he did for this particular interview. So if after his efforts to break into the school, there had been no high drama for the would-be criminal in the poem, which is what David makes himself out to be, the poem would have failed. So if he goes to the school and doesn't break in, then there's not really a poem. So instead, David allowed himself to become a small-time criminal with the possibility of being arrested and going to jail for breaking and entering into the school if he got caught. So this is what he wrote. Behind a flashlight's cane of light, I climbed a staircase, almost a ladder, and found a door. On the second nudge of my shoulder, it broke into a hallway as dark as history. So the question is, did that really happen? And David said, no, it did not. So here's what happened. So the story about the desk is actually true. And some of the details he has in the early part of the poem are true. But when he went back, the desk wasn't at the school. They'd replaced all of them. So he talked to the people in the building to see if the desk was anyplace else in the school. And they said, no, they had replaced all the desks and they had disposed of everything. So the desk with his father's name carved in it, and subsequently his own name, was no longer there. But that would not have made an interesting poem. So David says, and this is the quote, it wasn't the way it was in the poem. It might have been an open door or an open window around the back of the building, but I didn't break any windows. He did go over to the school to kind of look around, but the desk wasn't there. But for the sake of the poem, he had to change the truth. Okay, he had to find a new truth that was more interesting, more poignant, and more important than just the simple facts of what happened. And of course, he does that. So for David, it was all about metaphor. And this took me a number of years to put it all together. And so metaphor is simply a symbol. It's one thing conceived as representing another. And so what David impressed upon us is when we had our poem, we looked for things within the poem that you could group together. These things that sort of bound the poem in a metaphoric possibility. Most of the time we didn't get there with our initial drafts, but there was the potential. And so if we had 3 or 4 or 5 words that were all sort of grouped within the same meaning or idea or subject matter, he would point this out as a possible metaphor. And that's the key to writing poetry. And he would talk about this all the time. Get to the deep hidden meaning, which is the metaphor. So let me hang on one second while I get a drink. So this is Sign for My Father Who Stressed the Bunt. Now, this poem is probably one of David's most recognized poems, and it has been used for high school examinations for a student to or college entrance to read the poem and discuss what's going on. And there's really 2 things happening in this poem, and this is the method that David tried to instill in us, which is to have a subject, which here it's all about sports and about baseball, but also to have all of this mean something greater. It has to have a deeper meaning. So I'm going to read this poem. And it's a wonderful poem. And if you look at it, you'll see the baseball language. But in the end, all of it means something completely different. On the rough diamond, the hand-cut field below the dog lot and barn, we rehearsed the strict technique of bunting. I watched from the infield, the mound, the backstop, as your left hand climbed the bat, your legs and shoulders squared toward the pitcher. You could drop it like a seed down either baseline. I admired your style, but not enough to take my eyes off the bank that served as our center field fence. Years passed, 3 leagues of organized ball, no few lives. I could homer into the left field lot of Carmichael Motors, and still you stress the same technique, the crouch and spring, the lead arm absorbing just enough impact. The whole tiresome pitch about basics never changing, and I never learned what you were laying down. Like a hand brushed across the bill of a cap, let this be the sign I'm getting a grip on the sacrifice. So what's so absolutely wonderful about this poem is it's all about the father teaching the son how to play baseball, how to bunt. And that simple act is just part of the game. But the son really, he wanted the big home run, game-winning run. He wanted to sort of be the hero of the diamond with all of the stuff that kids dream about. But the father laid down what was most important. And of course, in the end, the narrator realized that the father was sacrificing everything for the son. And now the son is understanding this, that he has a grip on the sacrifice. It's a great metaphor. So now what's interesting also about this is if you go to Canton, Georgia, and I've taken a number of people on what I call the David Bottoms tour. We get in my car and I drive around and I show them all these places. And if you go to Canton and don't go not into the city, But if you go to where Williamson Barbecue is and turn left, right there is on the right-hand side is a shopping center. And I think it's a Harbor Freight now. It used to be a Kmart years and years ago. All of that was David's grandfather's farm. He had his general store there, the house, the dog lot, the makeshift baseball field. They had the horse pens. Everything was there, and it was sold back in the early '80s, and it was all of it was torn down, and it was turned into a Kmart and a shopping center. And there's a racetrack, gas station, and an Enterprise car dealership there. But across the street is the Kentucky Fried Chicken. And if you go there and stand in the at the Kentucky Fried Chicken, that's exactly where David's house was when he grew up as a kid. Now it's a 4-lane road now, but back in the day it was just 2 lanes, 1 lane going each way. Many years ago, I pulled into the parking lot, went inside, and ordered something at Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I mentioned to the kid who was handing me my food and taking my order that this used to be David Bottom's house right there. And he had no idea what I was talking about. But anyways, that whole area was where David grew up. And the importance of that is it keeps coming back to him in his poetry. And you'll see that when you read his later poetry. Poems about the country store and a few other things. David said to me one time that when he can't fall asleep at night, in his mind, he walks the property. And so it's still there in his mind and in his memory and in his thoughts. And he said that they were like pocket charms against oblivion, things that are going to disappear, and the only way that they remain is in your mind. And he said that the only thing you get to take with you to heaven are your memories. And so David constantly walked the property of his youth, his grandfather's farm. So the next poem I'm going to read. Well, I like this. I don't always write poetry, but when I do, I seek the truth and change the world. I really feel like that's what David was doing with his poetry. He was always seeking the truth. And we had many conversations on this, finding the absolute truth. And that always came through metaphor. And like I said, it took me years to figure this out. And he told me all the time. But it took me a long time to get to that point where I understood it enough to employ it in my own poetry. But it is the most important thing. So Joseph Campbell was incredibly important to David. When I had him, David, for poetry class or other classes, we always would read Joseph Campbell. There's a book of an interview with him. And Campbell just has the most profound ideas about life and the world and myth, especially. And this one is a great quote by him. It says, "Render the quality of that experience insofar as it pushes right through to the ultimate mystery of being and life itself." And I chose this because that's really what you're doing as a writer. It's what David was doing. You're pushing through to the ultimate mystery. And that has to be done through metaphor. And it gets you to life itself. What is the most important thing? And it's answered quite often. But David loved Joseph Campbell. He liked reading the Russians. He liked Robert Penn Warren. But we always were coming back to the myth that Campbell explained. Black Elk Speaks, all these different people that had myth as a basis of their writing and of their intellectual life. And Campbell was like that. So this is one of David's early poems. And it's the title poem of his book, Shooting Rats at the Bibb County Dump. And what's interesting about this, David gives us the entire setup of the poem. It's a scene, But then at the very end, there's the turn. And he used to always talk about, can you find the turn in a poem where the poet's discussing something and then it turns and the poet gives you what they really want you to have. And so he does this, and it comes in these last 3 lines. Loaded on beer and whiskey, we ride to the dump in carloads to turn our headlights across the wasted field, freeze the startled eyes of rats against mounds of rubbish. Shot in the head, they jump only once, lie still like dead beer cans. Shot in the gut or rump, they writhe and try to burrow into garbage, hide in old truck tires, rusty oil drums, cardboard boxes scattered across the mounds, or else drag themselves on 4 legs across our beams of light toward the darkness at the edge of the dump. It's the light they believe kills. We drink and load again. Let them crawl for all they're worth into the darkness we're headed for. It's really a wonderful poem. And I love how in the beginning of the first stanza, he ends on the word rubbish. It's a softer word than garbage or trash. He's got wonderful lyrics going through here, lyricism, and some internal rhyme and assonance and consonants, but it's never overpowering. It's simply a story about shooting the rats. But the last 3 lines turn, and he gives us what he really wants, which is to say, this is where we're headed, into this darkness. So this next poem is called An Absence, and this is from his poem Under World Under doggone, I forgot the name of it. Prayer Porch is what I just call it. Anyways, this has the same kind of metaphoric quality. And so he mentions also his grandfather's farm and so forth, returning as he does constantly back to the things of his childhood, but they all have meaning. There's a meaning behind them that takes us to a greater meaning. And he asks this one question, or he says this one statement, that only one thing matters, and he answers it at the end. It's an absence, essentially, but the poem is an absence. Near the end, only one thing matters. Yes, it has something to do with the moon and the way the moon balances so nervously on the ridge of the barn. This is the landscape of my childhood, my grandfather's country store, his barn, his pasture, his chicken houses are already falling. But near the end, only one thing matters. It has to do with the prudence of his woods, the way the trembling needles prove the wind. Let's sit here by the fence and watch for the fox that comes each night to the pasture. Imagine how the moon cools the water in the cow pond. Yes, things happen in the cool white spaces, those moments you turn your head, the way the trembling branch suggests the owl, or the print by the pond suggests the fox. Near the end, though, only one thing matters, and nothing, not even the fox, moves as quickly. And so here he is returning to this area of his childhood. It's his grandfather's store, his barn, his pasture. It's where Bottoms grew up. He spent all this time there. I mean, it was across the street from his house. He was always at his grandparents'. He's always at the country store, always running around the pasture and the barn, exploring. Now, I say this, that if anyone ever wants to go on the David Bottoms tour, I'll be glad to take you and show you where all this stuff was. But the one thing I've never done and I want to do, and anyone's welcome to come with me, is behind the racetrack gas station and behind the shopping center, there are still woods back there. And I was told by someone not too long ago that those are essentially unchanged since David was a child. They were never torn down, and they're just there. And I've always, about the last 6 or 8 months now, I've wanted to go over there and walk them just to see. But anyways, what's wonderful about this poem is David does exactly what he's always taught us, was to find the deep hidden meaning, a metaphor to tell you something else. And what he's using here, he's using the farm and the things in nature to tell you that only one thing matters. And I've read this a couple of ways. When I read the beginning of it, I always think, well, only one thing matters, and that's memory, what you can remember and what you can take with you. But by the time we get to the end, I believe he's talking about death, that nothing moves so quietly, not even the fox. Nothing moves as quietly as death. And he's got some other poems that he kind of mentions this. So this is a poem that has David back in the grandfather's store. It's called My Old Man's Dagger. And it's simply, he presents a scene, and then there's a turn that gives you what he really wants you to know. My old man's homemade dagger. In a battered desk in the feed room of my grandfather's store, I came across a knife my father had made. High school, I'm guessing. Metal shop. A dagger with a bone handle, blade cut from a metal file. It looked ugly, dangerous. Put that back, he told me when I brought it into the store. He hardly glanced at the two-edged blade, good only for murder. I was young, obedient. I put it back, but I have held it for years in my memory, just as he must have held it in that desk drawer of rusted sockets and wrenches. Ugly, yes, but one of those things so well made we could hardly let it go. Here it is. This is David returning back to his childhood, writing about his memory, but it means something else. It's not simply the scene. And he peppers this with a few things. It's ugly, it's dangerous, it's good only for murder, which is, I think, a brilliant line. It's locked away in a drawer of rusted sockets and wrenches. And yet he can't let it go. He can't let the memory go. He can barely maybe let go of the knife and put it back. But being an obedient child, he does what he's told. So I always liked that poem. So this is really what David impressed upon all of his students. And this idea that in your poetry, you should have a deeper meaning than just the scene. Something bigger has to occur. And it's the DHM, the deep hidden meaning. And essentially, as he would always say, it's the metaphor. What is the metaphoric quality that we are trying to seek and employ, so that what we're handing to the reader becomes more than simply a scene that takes place? So I always think of this as the roadmap for life. A poet has a desire to write a poem of significance. And this is something David really emphasized. David pushed all of his students to write poems of necessity, poems that changed our lives. And maybe 50 people read it, maybe 2 people, maybe a million people read your poem. But regardless, write a poem of necessity. And I can remember being in class one day, and Christine Swint wrote this poem about her son going off to college. And it was such a heartfelt poem that she could barely get through the poem reading it just for workshop. And we ended up spending about 20 minutes discussing poems of necessity. And David highlighted how this particular poem for Christine was a poem of immense necessity. And with her creating the poem, employing the techniques she had in the poem, she was able to bring about a level of significance for herself, but for everyone else in the classroom, and really for anyone else who would read the poem. And so this is what David wanted us to do. He wanted us to write poems of necessity, find the deeper hidden meaning, and to do that, it was always through metaphor. And these were poems to change our lives. And I've said this before, but having met David when I was so young, early 20s, he, except for my immediate family, David is the most influential person in my life. Everything. I mean, my writing, what I read. If he suggested I go read somebody, I would read him. And then David got me my job at Reinhardt University. It all came about because they'd contacted him, and David gave them my name. So the poet themselves oftentimes give you more than just poetry. And that was the case with David. David gave me so much in my life that there's only one way to pay him back. And that is for me to pay it forward to my students, which I try to do. And it's the only way I can do it. Write good poetry, write good novels, think deeply about these things, try to write poetry of necessity, but teach my students to do the same thing. Hence why I decided to present this idea of David's to everybody, because he wanted you to understand the power of metaphor and how the metaphoric quality is what's going to allow someone to be transformed or to be moved. It doesn't matter if they live in Poland, England, South America, or the United States. If the poem is a poem of significance, it's going to influence and change that person regardless of where they are. So anyways, it's been my pleasure to talk about this. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Bill,
Okay.
for reviving the work of former Georgia Poet Laureate David Bottoms. For both Bill and Jim, we have some questions in the Q&A box. So if you all wouldn't mind staying back, Jim as well, and answering a question or two before we end our session. Great.
Sure.
The first question is, Jim mentioned Sellers championing Byron Herbert Reese, and Bill mentioned Bottoms reading Joseph Campbell. What other mentors, poets, authors influenced the poetry of Sellers and Bottoms?
Well, for David, I mean, I know that he was always, later in life reading the Russian novelists. He would come in all the time and say, "I'm reading, War and Peace or whatever," and he would, ask, tell our students to read that. Or, but Charles Wright, Robert Penn Warren, but most importantly, I think it was Theodore Redke. He loved Redke, and I took a class where David taught nothing but James Dickey and Theodore Redke. And Redke was, I think that was his poet. He loved uh, um, uh, the poetry of his, the nature of the fauna and the greenhouse poems and so forth. That was really David's. I think that was his go-to guy. He read a lot, and so he's influenced by things early on, but middle of his life toward his older years, I think it was Theodore Redke.
Jim, can you speak to Bettie Sellers?
Well, I know that Betty was very fond of the Romantic poets, the British Romantic poets. I read the poem of hers where she alludes to one of Wordsworth's poems. She was certainly a fan of William Wordsworth, Blake, and well, just the romantics in general, and kind of, you know, going up through the line of poets that were influenced by the romantic poets up to Robert Frost. She was certainly a fan of Robert Frost's. As far as poets that were her contemporaries, I can't honestly remember having read too much about her opinions of those poets, but I know that those early romantic poets had a great influence on her.
And one last question before we end the session for you both. Can you tell the audience what projects you may have forthcoming so that they can follow your work in the future? Jim?
Well, I've been working a lot lately on nonfiction essays. So I've had a chapter published recently in a book of poems by about the Texas folk musician Townes Van Zandt, and also one on music and Robert Morgan's poems. So I continue to be fascinated by the connection between music and poetry, and I continue to write about that. I've got a lot of memoirs based on the time I spent at Vanderbilt University in the 1970s, going to hear music, Guy Clark and Townes Van Zandt, and all of those great musicians. Kind of the not so much the Nashville country music that you think of, but the sort of underground country folk poets that were there. And I one day I would like to put all those together and kind of have a book about the origins of Americana music, maybe in those 1970s musicians that were around Nashville at that time. So I'm working a lot on both music and poetry still.
Bill, could you tell the audience what you may have forthcoming and how they can follow you?
Yes, I'd love to, because it's going to be exciting. I have a new novel coming out. It'll be out next year. It's called Haircuts for the Dead. And literally today, I just mailed a copy to this man in Hollywood who's a producer. And he says, I think I might be interested in it. So, you know, I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that. But Haircuts for the Dead will be out next year by Mercer University Press. I have been diligently working on a book on Flannery O'Connor. It's called Andalusia, Flannery O'Connor and the Family Farm. And I am demonstrating how the farm was absolutely an integral part of her writing. I've tracked down the real misfit, and well, he's been dead since 1975, but I found his niece, and she's going to give me a photograph of the real misfit from A Good Man Is Hard to Find. So I've been creating this nonfiction book on how the farm influenced all of her fiction. And the deadline to my publisher is June 30th. So I'm busy working on that. And so I'm looking forward to it. And I'll put a plug in for the James Dickey Review. This December, we will publish our 40th anniversary issue. And so it'll be one of our highlights. So it's been going for 40 years. So that and teaching, that keeps me busy.
Well, with little over a week left until April National Poetry Month, it has been such a pleasure to hear both of you talk about our two former Georgia Poets Laureate, David Bottoms and Bettie Sellers. It has been a pleasure to talk with you. And to the audience, please join us tomorrow for a full program. It is in the chat. And so we hope that we will see you on Saturday for more sessions of Revival Lost Southern Voices. Jim, Bill, thank you so much.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.